In 1922, a line was drawn on a map. It was supposed to be a political solution to end a war, but instead, it lit the fuse on a new kind of conflict. This is the story of how that line planted the seeds of mistrust and violence that would tear a community apart for generations. This border wasn't just a mark on paper, it was a fault line carved through towns, fields, and families. On one side, the new Irish Free State was born. On the other, 6 counties in the northeast of the island became Northern Ireland, a self-governing state created to remain part of the United Kingdom. For its Protestant, Unionist majority, this was the fulfillment of a promise, a guarantee that their identity and their allegiance to the British Crown would be safe. But for the large Catholic, nationalist minority now living within this new state, it was a disaster. They saw themselves as Irish citizens, cut off from their own nation by a border they never wanted. The period from 1922 to the late 1960s is often painted as a long, uneasy quiet before the storm of the Troubles. But it wasn't quiet. It was a time of deep, systemic division, where the foundations of the coming conflict were laid, brick by painful brick. This is the story of those 40 years. A story of 2 communities living side by side, yet worlds apart. It's the story of how a state, born in crisis, failed to manage the fears and resentments of its own people, paving the way for decades of devastating violence. To get why Northern Ireland was born, we have to rewind to the years just before its creation. The entire island of Ireland was in chaos. The Irish War of Independence, fought by the Irish Republican Army, IRA, was raging with the goal of ending British rule completely. At the same time, a political battle had been fought for decades over Home Rule, the idea of a devolved Irish Parliament in Dublin. For Irish nationalists, it was a step toward freedom. But for the Unionists of Ulster, who were concentrated in the industrial northeast, the idea of being ruled by a Catholic majority parliament in Dublin was terrifying. They were proudly British, overwhelmingly Protestant, and they were ready to fight to stop it. The British government, caught between these 2 immovable forces, looked for a compromise. That compromise was the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. It didn't propose 1 Home Rule Parliament, but 2. One for the 26 counties in the south, and one for 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster in the north. Those 6 counties, Antrim, Armagh, Down, Fermanagh, Derry, and Tyrone, were specifically chosen to create a state with a permanent, built-in Protestant Unionist majority. While Unionists accepted this new arrangement as their best bet for staying in the UK, nationalists saw it as a total betrayal, a deliberate carving up of their country just to appease one side. In 1922, after the Anglo-Irish Treaty officially ended the War of Independence, the Partition of Ireland became a hard reality. Northern Ireland formally opted out of the new Irish Free State, and the line on the map was now an international border. But this border was born in violence. The years from 1920 to 1922 saw what some historians have called a pogrom, particularly in the new capital, Belfast. It was a period of savage and unprecedented communal violence. Fearing for their place in a new Ireland, Loyalists drove thousands of Catholic workers from their jobs in the shipyards and factories. Sectarian riots exploded. Gun battles were fought in the streets, and whole neighborhoods were burned down. In just 2 years, around 550 people were killed across the 6 counties, with Belfast as the epicenter of the violence. Over 20,000 people, most of them Catholics, were forced from their homes, becoming refugees in their own city. The violence wasn't entirely one-sided. The IRA carried out attacks on security forces and Protestant civilians. But the vast majority of the victims came from the Catholic minority, who made up only a quarter of Belfast's population but accounted for well over half the dead. This brutal beginning set the tone for the new state. It was founded in an atmosphere of intense fear and suspicion, with a minority that felt under siege and a majority that believed its new state was under constant threat. A boundary commission was set up in 1924 to review the border. Nationalists desperately hoped it would transfer large Catholic majority areas like Tyrone and Fermanagh to the Free State, believing this would make Northern Ireland economically unviable and cause it to collapse. Those hopes were crushed. The Commission's final report suggested only minor changes and was ultimately buried to prevent more unrest. The border, drawn in a rush of politics and violence, was here to stay. For the 500,000 Catholics living in Northern Ireland, a harsh reality set in. They were now a permanent minority in a state they didn't recognize, a state that seemed built against them from day one. With the border now permanent, the Unionist government, led for its first 2 decades by Prime Minister James Craig, started building the new state. Their main goal was simple: secure Northern Ireland's existence and maintain the union with Britain at all costs. From their point of view, the large Catholic and nationalist minority was fundamentally disloyal, a fifth column that wanted to destroy the state from within and force them into a united Ireland. This fear shaped nearly every government policy for the next 50 years. In a famous and often misquoted speech, Prime Minister Craig declared he was an Orangeman first, and that he stood for a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state. While the full context of his speech was more complex, the phrase captured a stark reality. The state was being run for the benefit of one community. Discrimination wasn't just occasional, it was systemic, woven into the fabric of everyday life. One of the most effective tools for keeping Unionist control was gerrymandering. In 1922, the Northern Ireland government got rid of the proportional representation voting system, which had been designed by the British to protect minorities, for local elections. They then redrew the electoral boundaries for local councils. The impact was immediate. In places like Derry City, where Catholics were the majority of the population, the voting wards were manipulated so that the Unionist minority consistently won control of the city council. The same thing happened in counties Fermanagh and Tyrone. This political engineering guaranteed Unionist power over local government, even in places where they were outnumbered. And controlling local councils was key, because they held the power over 2 things everyone needed: houses and jobs. There was a chronic shortage of public housing, and councils had long waiting lists. In Unionist-run areas, homes were often allocated based on religion and politics. Protestant families were frequently given houses ahead of Catholic families who had been waiting for years. This wasn't just about rewarding supporters, it was a political tactic. By controlling where people lived, Unionist councils could stop Catholics from moving into an area and upsetting the electoral balance of a ward. Job discrimination was also rampant, especially in the public sector. The police force, renamed the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, was consistently over 90% Protestant. Even more feared was the Ulster Special Constabulary, an armed reserve police force known as the B Specials. Recruited almost exclusively from the Protestant community, often from the same men who had been in the Ulster Volunteer Force, they were seen by Catholics not as peacekeepers, but as a sectarian militia designed to defend the Unionist state. Their role in attacks on Catholics during the violence of the early 1920s had cemented a legacy of deep fear and mistrust. For Catholics, the message was clear: this state wasn't for them. Its symbols, its police, and its government all represented a political tradition that was hostile to their own. Political life became frozen. Nationalists often boycotted the Northern Ireland Parliament at Stormont, refusing to legitimize a system they saw as fundamentally unfair. But this only tightened the Unionist grip on power, allowing them to govern without any real opposition. The Catholic community mostly turned inward, relying on the Church and its own social networks. For decades, they existed as a society within a society, nursing their grievances. They lived with the daily humiliations of being treated like second-class citizens, passed over for jobs, denied housing, and viewed with suspicion by the police. David Trimble, a future Unionist leader who would go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize, later described the Northern Ireland of this era as a cold house for Catholics. It was a time of tense coexistence, where an outward calm hid deep and dangerous fractures just waiting to crack. The middle decades of the 20th century brought huge external shocks but little internal change to Northern Ireland. World War II affected the 2 communities in completely different ways. For Unionists, Northern Ireland's role in the war was a powerful confirmation of their Britishness. Belfast's shipyards and factories were vital to the Allied war effort, and the region's location in the Atlantic was strategically crucial. This shared sacrifice strengthened the bond with Great Britain, a bond sealed in blood. But for many nationalists, it was England's war. The Irish Free State, now called ERA, stayed neutral, a policy that was extremely popular in the South. This neutrality created huge tension along the border. While thousands of individual Catholics from Northern Ireland did volunteer for the British forces, the official nationalist political position was one of disengagement. This only hardened the Unionist view that the Catholic minority was disloyal for refusing to stand with Britain in its darkest hour. After the war, the new Labour government in London created the modern welfare state. This meant a national health service, unemployment benefits, and a huge expansion of social housing and education. These reforms were rolled out in Northern Ireland too. For the first time, both communities had access to free healthcare and a social safety net. A new system of grammar schools and universities opened doors for bright young people from all backgrounds, offering a path to a better life that had never existed before. But even the welfare state was sometimes filtered through a sectarian lens. While the central government paid for these programs, local Unionist councils were often in charge of delivering them, especially when it came to allocating new houses, which continued the old patterns of discrimination. Still, the changes were profound. A new generation of Catholics was growing up healthier, better educated, and with much higher expectations than their parents. They had access to a world of ideas beyond their local parish, and they were starting to realize that their position as second-class citizens was not something they had to accept. Politically, though, almost nothing moved. The Unionist Party kept its unbroken hold on power at Stormont. Nationalist politics remained divided and ineffective. The only real challenge to the state during this period came from the IRA. In 1956, it launched the Border Campaign, a series of guerrilla attacks on RUC stations and customs posts along the border. The campaign was a complete failure. It had very little support from the wider Catholic population, who were tired of violence and more focused on making a living. The Northern Ireland government used its Special Powers Act to intern hundreds of suspected Republicans without trial, and by 1962, the IRA called off its campaign, defeated and demoralized. To the Unionist government, the failure of the border campaign seemed to prove that their hardline security approach worked. The state felt secure. But the silence that followed was deceptive. The resentments that had been simmering for 40 years hadn't gone away. Discrimination in jobs and housing continued. The political system was still rigged. The two communities lived in a state of informal segregation, going to different schools, reading different newspapers, playing different sports, and mostly living in different neighborhoods. They were two societies, divided by history, religion, and dreams, living in a forced and loveless union. The long silence wasn't peace. It was the slow, steady build-up of pressure in a sealed container.
The 1960s felt like a shockwave hitting the world, and Northern Ireland wasn't immune. A new spirit of protest was everywhere, from the civil rights movement in the United States to student uprisings in Paris. For the first time in a generation, real change felt possible. This global energy met a new kind of Catholic in Northern Ireland. Thanks to the post-war education reforms, a generation of articulate, university-educated Catholics was coming of age. They read about Martin Luther King Jr. and the fight for justice in America. They watched it all unfold on TV. And they looked at their own society and asked a simple question: why not here? Why should they be denied basic rights in their own country? The grievances were the same ones their parents and grandparents had lived with for decades: discrimination in housing and jobs, a political system that shut them out, and a police force they saw as the armed wing of the Unionist Party. But the response this time was different. Instead of boycotting Parliament or turning to armed struggle, this new generation chose the language of civil rights. In 1967, a new organization was formed, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, or NICRA. Its demands were radical but, on the surface, reasonable. They weren't calling for a united Ireland. Instead, they asked for British rights for British citizens. Their main demands included: one man, one vote, to end the system in local elections where business owners got extra votes; an end to the gerrymandering of electoral districts; laws to ban discrimination; and the disbandment of the B specials. They deliberately copied the tactics of the American civil rights movement, using peaceful marches and protests to put a spotlight on injustice. Their anthem was even the American civil rights classic, "We Shall Overcome." The strategy was to expose the ugly reality of Northern Ireland to the world's media and, crucially, to the British government in London, which had mostly ignored the region for 40 years. The first big civil rights march took place in August 1968, from Coal Island to Dungannon, protesting unfair housing allocation by the local council. It went off mostly peacefully. But the reaction from hardline Unionists was instant and furious. To them, the civil rights movement was just a front for the IRA, a Trojan horse trying to destroy the state and push for a united Ireland. Figures like the fiery Protestant preacher Ian Paisley denounced the movement, whipping up loyalist fears. The turning point came on October 5, 1968. A civil rights march was planned for the city of Derry. The government banned it. The organizers decided to go ahead anyway. As several hundred peaceful marchers, including a member of the British Parliament, walked through the city, they were brutally attacked by the RUC. Police officers drew their batons and charged, indiscriminately beating men, women, and children. Crucially, the television cameras were there. That night, shocking images of RUC officers clubbing unarmed protesters were broadcast across the UK and the world. For the first time, people outside Northern Ireland saw the reality of the state. The illusion of a peaceful, stable region was shattered in an instant. For Catholics in Northern Ireland, it was a moment of radicalization. It proved what they'd always believed. The state wouldn't reform and its police force was there to enforce a sectarian order, not the law. For young people especially, peaceful protest now seemed naive. The state's violence was met with an explosion of community anger. The stage was set for the Battle of the Bogside, the arrival of British troops, and the slide into the 3 decades of conflict that became known as the Troubles. The long, slow-burning fuse that was lit in 1922 had finally reached the dynamite. The 40-odd years between the Partition of Ireland and the first civil rights marches weren't an accident. They were the incubation period for the Troubles. The political deal of 1922 didn't solve a problem. It created a new one. It drew a border that left a large minority feeling abandoned and powerless, while creating a majority that felt constantly insecure, seeing enemies both inside and out. The state that resulted was inherently unstable. For decades, the Unionist government put its own survival ahead of equality and justice, believing that keeping control required keeping one community down. They built a cold house for Catholics, a system where discrimination in voting, housing, and jobs wasn't a bug, but a feature of state policy. This system bred a deep resentment that peaceful politics seemed powerless to fix. When a new, educated generation finally stood up to demand not a united Ireland, but basic civil rights, the state's violent response exposed its own intolerance and fragility. The events of the late 1960s weren't the start of the conflict, but the inevitable explosion of pressure that had been building for nearly 50 years. The line drawn on a map back in 1922 had become a chasm of mistrust and grievance, and the struggle to bridge that divide was only just beginning. The long, slow struggle of the past decades was about to explode into a fast, brutal, and tragic war. If you found this exploration of Northern Ireland's history valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into complex historical events. Thanks a million for joining us today. If this story spoke to you, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you'll never miss our next journey into the moments that shaped our world. Every like, share, comment, and subscription makes a real difference. Each one adds a penny to Emerald Chronicle without costing you a thing. That's how we keep this project alive, since we rely entirely on YouTube to fund our research and production. When you share our videos, you're not just passing along a story, you're helping keep Irish culture alive and bringing it to audiences everywhere. And while we sometimes use AI to recreate images from the past, we do so under a fully open policy, drawing only from public domain sources. We're careful to respect copyright and original artists, and all of our research, writing, and production is 100% human, with only the occasional exception for narration. We've also taken your feedback to heart. Every video now includes full source listings in the description, so you can see exactly where each story comes from. Emerald Chronicle is a one-man project, created by Irish historian Jerry HANNAN in Limerick City. If you'd like to reach out, you'll find his email in the description. And here's where you come in, we'd love to hear your ideas. Drop a comment with the stories from Ireland's past that you'd like us to explore. We don't just listen, we act on your suggestions, because together we can share Ireland's history with the world. Thanks again for watching, for learning, and for helping us keep history alive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the past close, because it still has so much to say.